Good afternoon, and welcome to Great Decisions 2021. This is the 7th session of the program sponsored by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. My name is Joel Glassman. I'm the Vice President of the World Affairs St. Louis, and I will serve as the host for this program. I'd like to begin by thanking the University of Missouri St. Louis and their international office, UMSL Global, for their continued support and partnering with the World Affairs Council for so very many years to present this program to our St. Louis audience. World Affairs St. Louis is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that connects the St. Louis metropolitan region to the world. Founded in 1948, our mission is to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. Great Decisions, or the Great Decisions Program, is a national program of the Foreign Policy Association, which was founded in 1918. The Great Decisions Program is itself more than 70 years old, provides an opportunity for U.S. audiences to learn about and understand complex foreign policy issues of our time. The Foreign Policy Association and Great Decisions operate on the principle that an informed citizenry is essential for a democratic society. Great Decisions is the largest U.S.-based discussion program about foreign policy. It has been the honor and privilege of World Affairs St. Louis to serve as the local host for this important program for more than a decade. Today's agenda, as in the recent past, is we will view a video prepared by the Foreign Policy Association about today's topic. We'll see about 5 minutes of that video at the beginning of our program. Then we will have a lecture by Professor Jean-Germain Gros from about 25 to 30 minutes. I'll be introducing Professor Gros shortly before he speaks. We will follow the lecture with a Q&A session of about 20 minutes, after which we will see the balance of the Foreign Policy Association. We will end by 1:30 as previously agreed upon. Today's topic is a U.S.-China competition in Africa. Throughout the world, we see growing U.S.-China competition for leadership and influence. As a more assertive China is challenging the long-established role of the United States as the leader and rule maker in the global system. In no place is this competition more clear than in Africa, where early Chinese investments have created an opportunity for China to play a leadership role in that increasingly challenges the U.S. role in Africa as well as around the world. Today, we will learn about and discuss the background and current state of that competition. Let's now focus on that very issue and watch the first few minutes of a video prepared by the Foreign Policy Association. We'll return with Professor Gros' lecture.
From South Africa to Ethiopia, from Nigeria to Kenya, the whole continent of Africa is under construction. New dams, highways, ports, bridges, and railroads are springing up. And many are bankrolled by Chinese cash. Great Decisions investigates how American policymakers are responding to China's presence in Africa, explores how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting China's ties to the continent, and asks how African governments can navigate the increasingly bitter rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Competing interests, the U.S. and China in Africa. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Roberts International Airport, the main gateway to the West African nation of Liberia, was in dire need of refurbishment.
Finally, that shame that we all, and we do feel shame when we land at the airport, and the plane is just going, you know.
But cash-strapped Liberia could not afford the $50 million price tag to renovate the passenger terminal. So Liberian officials made the same decision as their counterparts in countless other countries across Africa and around the world. They turned to China.
I was the liaison between the president's office and the Chinese embassy. And one of the projects we ended up doing with the Chinese was the rehabilitation of the terminal at Roberts International Airport. What I would say about the Chinese process is how fast it is. The speed with which we can negotiate a deal is really important.
The same pattern has been repeated in nearly every African country.
There is hardly anywhere in Nigeria that you go to today that you don't see the visibility of China in terms of infrastructural projects. You see that they are constructing or remodeling projects from the airport to roads to hospitals to everywhere.
Ethiopia borrowed about 1.3 billion for the Addis Djibouti railway. Kenya borrowed 2 billion for the rail lines. Those are incredibly huge projects and much needed infrastructure development in Africa.
Now, American policymakers from both parties are speaking out about the need for the U.S. to counter China's rapid expansion in Africa.
China is not at all blind to the fact that there's a Southern Hemisphere, and they're making huge investments in Africa. They have a lot of resources on the table. I think we need to make sure we put the resources on the table. We need to step it up.
Just reducing our investment provides, of course, opportunity for other players to step in. Other players that have more efficient governments than we do, albeit not very transparent and not very virtuous governments like China. We have to be really careful. I always say I'd rather invest in the peaceful tools of feeding hungry people and infrastructure development and healthcare and energy than in the weapons of war.
For 4 years, the Trump administration put America's global rivalry with China at the center of its foreign policy.
It's clear to me that the United States is concerned about China, that Africa is part of that. When the United States released an Africa strategy a few years ago, it was primarily a China strategy. And if you look at the comments that the then National Security Advisor Bolton made when that strategy was released, it was mostly about China.
China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands.
I think in the case of Africa, the Chinese have made extraordinary efforts to increase their influence. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for the U.S. and European countries to be worried about what China's up to there. I think China's pursuing a very, very long-range strategy. And I don't think the United States for many years really had any coherent response.
But U.S. policymakers face a difficult question: how to counter China at a time when American politicians have little appetite to spend money on foreign aid.
The United States will no longer provide indiscriminate assistance across the entire continent without focus or prioritization.
Essentially, what Ambassador Bolton was trying to lay out was that the U.S. is going to target its funding towards key countries and particular strategic objectives. We, the U.S., need to get back in the game, but it's very difficult to get back in the game while also focusing on reducing the amount of development assistance to African nations.
Thank you. We'll watch the rest of this video after our Q&A session. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce my friend, Jean-Germain Gros. He's a specialist in African politics with an emphasis on Francophone Africa. He is particularly interested in the processes of democratization and economic development. In addition, he specializes in public policy administration with an emphasis on health policy, both in the US and the third world. Lately, he's been working on the very topic we're discussing, China's role in Africa, and he's recently published a paper with another University of Missouri St. Louis professor in that field. I believe it's introduced in his slideshow that will accompany his talk. At the conclusion of this talk, we'll have a Q&A session. You can begin to ask your questions by typing them into the Q&A function on Zoom. After the lecture is concluded, I'll field those questions on the Q&A apparatus, and I will direct them to Professor Gros, and he'll focus his attention on giving a response. So please don't hesitate to submit your questions through Q&A. And now let's turn the program over to Professor Jean-Germain Gros. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joel, for the introduction. Can everyone see my slide?
I don't see it.
How about now?
Still no.
Did you press the share screen button?
Yeah, hold on. I'm actually looking at the slide. I need to return, I guess, to
Zoom.
Zoom. Let me press the escape. No. Okay, let's see. Okay, share screen. Okay, share.
Go ahead and click on slideshow, and then that button all the way to the left. After you click on slideshow, it would be play from the start. There you go.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay, are we there? Well, thank you, Joel, once again for the introduction. I believe this is at least the second time that I'm speaking to this group. It's a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon, and I will focus, of course, on the topic of China-Africa relations. I should mention that this presentation is based in part on an article that I recently co-published, as Joel mentioned, with my colleague in the business school, Hongge Fong, called Theorizing Sino-African Relations, a Constructivist Perspective. It was published in the Journal of International Relations and Foreign Policy in June 2019. And if anyone is interested in obtaining a copy of this article, we could make arrangement afterward so that we can make it available. So here is the background. In the last 2 decades, political and economic relations between China and Africa have grown rapidly, with trade volumes increasing from about $11 billion in 2000 to $180 billion in 2018. So a tremendous growth. China is the provider of, it's the leading provider of financial support for infrastructure development in Africa, even though the United States is still the continent's largest aid provider. Thus, naturally, the question arises, is all beneficial? To put it in familiar historical idiom, is Africa undergoing a new scrambling reminiscent of the scrambling that occurred in the late 19th century, but this time with the Chinese as the scramblers? Once again, is Africa undergoing a new scrambling reminiscent of the scrambling of the late 19th century, but this time with the Chinese as the scramblers? What do the evidence actually say? I will present some evidence to try to answer the question, and then I will put Sino-African relations in a larger historical perspective, and then I will offer a conclusion on what I think is really going on between China and Africa. So let's look at China's outward investment in 2015. I started writing this piece in 2018, and so this is the last year for which we had evidence, or we had data. But given that much of Africa has been closed in the last year or so, I think that the data that we have here are still pretty much relevant. So what do we have in terms of China's FDI overseas? So this is table 1 from our article. So table 1 shows that in 2015, Africa's share of China's outward FDI was about 2%. Asia took about 75% of Chinese outward FDI. Okay. So 3/4 of China's foreign direct investment essentially occur in its own neighborhood in Asia. Europe took up about 5%, Latin America 8.6%, North America 7.4%, Oceania 2.7%, and Africa 2.0%. So based on this figure alone, Africa's share of China's total FDI was relatively modest. This would seem to suggest that, by contrast, 75% of total Chinese FDI occurred in Asia, highlighting the importance of proximity and other factors. So that as far as FDI is concerned, foreign direct investment is concerned, Africa is not a major target of Chinese foreign direct investment. This is not to suggest that from an African perspective, the amount of FDI that China is undertaking in Africa is inconsequential. From an African perspective, even though the net amount may be modest, but given that this is a continent that does not attract much in the way of FDI, 2% of Chinese foreign direct investment may be quite significant for Africa, though not necessarily so for China. So we need to have a nuanced view of Sino-African relations where foreign direct investment is concerned. Asia continues to be basically China's favorite target for capital investment. So let us look at now another set of statistics. This time, the top 5 industries of China's outward FDI stock by region. This is a very important table in that the perception of African economies, which is not entirely wrong, is that they are basically extractive economies. So the idea is that essentially Africa takes its resources from the ground or from the seabed and essentially sells them overseas. So colonialism, in fact, was seen essentially as an extractive endeavor. So if China is really scrambling in Africa, we would expect for Chinese direct investment to be concentrated in those areas of Africa's economies that are connected to extractive activities. So we break China's outward FDI stock by continent, and we came up with this table. So for Asia, what you find is that China's outward FDI stock is basically concentrated in the area of leasing and business services, followed by financial services, wholesale and retail trade, and then manufacturing comes, in fact, last in Asia. So this sort of is counterintuitive to perception of China as essentially an investor in labor-related activities. In Asia, at least, Chinese investment is concentrated in the service sector, which is again not what one would have expected. But let us shift. In Africa, this is what the picture looks like. That mining is, of course, the extractive activity par excellence. And it is true that it attracts about 10% of Chinese FDI stock in Africa. But 10% is very different from 90%. We would have expected, given Africa's riches in minerals, natural gas, oil, gold, diamonds, bauxite, and so on, we would have expected for Chinese investment to be larger than 10%. In fact, it's a little bit less than 10%. We find also that the amount of FDI from China going into construction matches closely what China invests in mining. So this is not surprising. If you go to Africa, what you find is that the Chinese are heavily present in construction, roads, bridges, dams, and so on. In other words, heavy industries, as intimated by the video. But we were somewhat surprised that construction is not more than 9.5%. Not surprisingly, China does not invest much in manufacturing and financial services. So that mining and construction attract the most amount of FDI in Africa. But again, if China were scrambling in Africa, one is that Chinese FDI in mining is higher in Europe than it is in Africa. In other words, one could make the argument that, and I'm not trying to be provocative here, that if China is scrambling, it's scrambling in Europe, not in Africa. Because the Chinese invest much more, almost 3 times as much in mining in Europe as they do in Africa. So, and one needs to be careful about the scrambling analogy. The same goes for Latin America. Chinese FDI is higher, moderately higher in Latin America than it is in Africa. So let me skip here because I have more table to discuss. And much more to say about Chinese behavior in Africa. But this table is very interesting. This figure is actually very interesting. Let me sort of go back to it. Table 4 in the paper, and it looks at the top 5 African countries where China has the most direct foreign investment. In other words, the countries that attract the most foreign direct investment by China were the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zambia. So those were the top 5 recipients of Chinese FDI from 2000 to 2015. And it is true that except for Ethiopia, all of these countries are essentially mineral rich. The DRC, of course, is probably the richest of them all. I mean, you name the mineral and you can find it in the DRC, including columbine tanzanite, which, as far as I know, can only be found in the DRC and is absolutely essential in the making of computer chips and by extension, cell phones, laptops, tablets, etc. Nigeria is, of course, Africa's largest producer of oil. It is now also an important producer of natural gas. South Africa, you probably know, for its endowment in gold and diamonds. And of course, Zambia is one of Africa's largest producer of copper. In fact, I think it may be the largest producer of copper in Africa, if not the world. So table 4 shows the nominal value of projects in 5 of the leading African countries where China has the most projects. So what it shows is that the nominal value of projects in each country is much bigger than corresponding Chinese FDI. Okay. In other words, and by projects here, we mean basically larger construction. So Ethiopia attracted $5.8 billion worth of projects, but only 175 million in FDI. Nigeria attracted $3.48 billion in projects, but only $50 million in FDI. In other words, the Chinese are not investing in Nigeria's oil and natural gas sector. They are investing more in road and infrastructure. So, in other words, there seems to be a Chinese preference for infrastructure projects over extractive activities. So can we still talk about scrambling? So that's the importance of table 4. But look at figure 1, which shows China's trade balance with the 5 African countries from 2000 to 2015. So what you find is that of these 5 African countries, China had a trade surplus with Ethiopia and Nigeria. Okay. It was a wash with Zambia. Basically, trade between Zambia and China was more or less in balance, as reflected in the blue line. And China had a trade deficit with South Africa. So if China, one could make the argument that if China were scrambling, one would have expected for it to have trade surpluses with all of the top 5 African countries, with which all of the top 5 trading partners in Africa. As far as I know, during colonialism, there were very few years when colonial powers had trade deficits with their colonies. And so again, one needs to be careful about drawing too much analogies between what's happening between Africa and China now and what happened in the late 19th century. In other words, we need to have a more nuanced approach to Sino-African relations. So this is my nuanced approach. First of all, even though there has been a great deal of change in Sino-African relations trade-wise between 2000 and now, there is a long history of interaction between China and Africa. In other words, Sino-African relations are not new. Furthermore, those relations are much more complex than media report make them out to be. In fact, if you look at Sino-African relations since the Chinese Revolution in 1949, I think, what you find is that there are different phases that these relations have gone through, each punctuated by specific interests, which can be readily identified. So from 1949 through 1961, Sino-African relations had one particular orientation. In the 1950s, as some of you may know, China essentially was a revolutionary state. And so closely allied with the former Soviet Union. So Sino-African relations in the 1950s were essentially strongly influenced by China's revolutionary posture and Africa's attempt to free itself from the yoke of colonialism. So in other words, there was a kind of third world fraternity between China and Africa in the 1950s. And so relations were essentially ideological. The Afro-Asian Conference of Head of States and Government held in Bandung in Indonesia in 1955 can be seen as the beginning of formal relations between China and Africa. Of course, in 1955, no country in Africa below the Sahara was independent. So the first African country with which China established diplomatic relations was Egypt in 1956. 1 year later, of course, Ghana became the first country in Black Africa to become independent. In 1958, the nominal value of trade between Egypt and China stood at $4 million USD, just $4 million. Reflecting the fact that in those days, once again, as I argue in the paper, Sino-African relations were more ideological than commercial. And quite frankly, in those days, China did not have much to sell to the rest of the world. But nevertheless, China did start relations with Africa and liberation movements. One of those liberation movements that China supported in the 1950s was the Algerian Liberation Front, the AFL, the ALF in French. The Chinese, however, supported the AFL at the same time that they exhorted it to seek a peaceful resolution to their conflict with the French. Algeria was, of course, not even a former French colony. It was part of overseas France. So Mao supported the AFL in its attempt to declare Algeria independent, but even in providing that support, as late as 1954, the Chinese were counseling the Algerians to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. So China, even in those days when it was at its most revolutionary, showed a degree of restraint and when it comes to its African relations. Relations between China and Africa entered a new phase in 1961, following the Sino-Soviet split and the intensification of decolonization in Africa. You may know that in 1961 alone, nearly 30 African countries became independent. So between 1961 and 1972, Chinese policy toward Africa shifted, wherein China presented itself as an alternative to both the former Soviet Union and the West. This is a period, in other words, of radicalization of Chinese policy toward Africa, with China supporting nationalist movement throughout Africa, including Patrice Lumumba and Antoine Gizanga in Congo and in the crisis of the Congo in the early 1960s. So whereas in the 1950s, Chinese policy toward Africa essentially largely dovetailed Soviet policy toward Africa. From 1961 to 1972, the break with the former Soviet Union resulted in China having a much more independent foreign policy toward Africa. And in fact, you find China presenting itself in Africa as an alternative to the former Soviet Union, as well as to the West, specifically the United States. So during this period too, Sino-African relations were largely strategic and political and ideological and almost entirely non-commercial. In fact, the biggest investment undertaken by China during this time was the construction of the Tazara, the railway line linking Dar es Salaam to the copper belt in Zambia. China offered to build the Tazara in 1965 and finished it in 1975. So this was the largest, you might say the largest infrastructure project at the time undertaken by China, not only in Africa, but in the world. But if you look at the terms of the financing, China provided 100% financing for the project at 0 interest rates, eventually forgiving 50% of this interest-free loan in 2011. So the biggest infrastructure project that China undertook in the world at this time was essentially a gift. And even the British would admit to that. So again, we need to be more nuanced in our critique. Now, toward the end of this period, something major, of course, happened. And that is the fact that Nixon went to China in 1972. And after that, there was a rapprochement between the US and China, which would have consequences for Sino-African relations. So now we have Sino-African relations into the third phase, which may be situated between 1972 and 1980. Okay, so once again, 1949, 1961, first phase, Sino-African relations were largely, ideological, but with China basically closely aligning its Africa policy to that of the former Soviet Union. Second phase, 1961, 1972, a more radicalized China presenting itself in Africa as an alternative to both the West and the former Soviet Union. And then the third phase, 1972, 1980, you find yet another shift in Sino-African relations where China continued to support movements and governments that were opposed to the former Soviet Union, but a kind of tacit toleration toward rightist regimes and movements supported by the US. So in other words, during this third phase, Sino-African relations resemble Sino-African relations in the 1990s with the US policy toward Africa against the former Soviet Union. In the 1950s, you had the exact opposite. So here you had some very interesting and almost moments during this period. So that, for example, when Cuba sent troops to Angola to support the pro-Soviet MPLA government in that country, China did not take too kindly to that, because the MPLA government was again seen as a client regime of the former Soviet Union. You also find at this time in Angola, the Chinese providing support to Jonas Savimbi, to UNITA. And UNITA, of course, had been created by the CIA. You find the Chinese going rather soft on regimes with which they had serious problems in the 1960s, such as the regime of Mobutu. Okay. And so, so China was pro-Lumumba in the early 1960s, but by the 1970s, it basically made peace with Lumumba's enemy, the Mobutu regime. What I'm beginning to suggest to you is Sino-African relations, not in isolation from Chinese foreign policy globally, but as part and parcel of that policy. So China does not have, an Africa policy that has remained constant, since the revolution. No, Chinese foreign policy toward Africa is shaped by the way in which China conceives of itself and the global system. So China has shown that it can change as its foreign policy as its posture in the world system changes. So there is not one Africa policy and then one policy for everything else where China is concerned. So then we enter the fourth phase from 1980 to 2000. This is a period of strategic retreat by China, which coincided with China's turn toward capitalism at the end of the Cold War. And here I have a very fascinating quote from Chinese Premier Zhao Jiang, who went to Africa and made this statement in 1982. And I quote, China is now adjusting its economy and it has its own difficulties. We must not be forced to do what is beyond our mutual strength. We must pay attention to efficiency, quality, and economic results. And we must ensure that aid bring benefits to our friends and help ourselves as well. End of quote. In other words, if there is a period when Chinese foreign policy toward Africa turned commercial, this is that period. And the quote made that very clear. That sentiment, of course, coincided once again with China's reform. And so look at the language: efficiency, quality, economic results, mutual benefits. You could find these concepts in any USAID aid document or any World Bank publications. So by this time, China is becoming essentially more like Western countries. So the final phase of Sino-African relations is where we are now, 2000 to 2021. It should be 2021. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so are you still with me? So this is the final phase, 2021, which is where this presentation opened. So during this phase, it is true that there has been an intensification in the Chinese presence in Africa, and also greater institutionalization. So a number of bodies were created to institutionalize the relationship. Two of the most important ones are the FOCAC. The FOCAC stands for Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. This is basically an institution that meets every 3 years. It alternates between China and Africa, and it brings together African heads of states and China's leaders. The meeting of the FOCAC has become like a must-attend meeting for African leaders. When the first one was held, I think in 2006, it brought together about 23 heads of states. And the last one, 50 heads of state attended. So this is where are made in terms of Sino-African cooperation. Another important institution in Sino-African relation is the CADF, the China-Africa Development Fund. This is an institution that is financed by China's development bank, and basically it aims to increase foreign direct investment in Africa by Chinese companies. So when you see infrastructure projects in Africa undertaken by Chinese companies, chances are that the financing of these infrastructure projects come from the CADF. But once again, as you may have seen in the first slide, Chinese direct foreign investment in Africa is still a relatively minor part of Chinese total investment. Although, again, we should not surmise for that however modest it may be from a Chinese standpoint, it is not consequential for Africa. So what can we conclude from Sino-African relations? What's the proper way of thinking about Sino-African relations in 2021? I think Chinese role in Africa is neither a new form of colonialism, nor is it a new form of benevolence. There are important differences between 2021 and 1885. In 1885, African countries did not have a choice as to which colonizing powers would colonize them. In 2021, on paper at least, African countries do not have to accept Chinese investment. They can turn it down if they want to. So I would not run roughshod to the fact that African countries are now independent states. They may be weak states, but they have a degree of agency in 2021 that the pre-colonial states in Africa did not have. So that's one thing. In 2021, the degree to which, of course, information flows bears no comparison to 1885. So if a Chinese worker mistreats a Ghanaian worker following Kumasi, automatically you see them. So that the tremendous abuses that took place in the Congo, as written by the unthinkable today.
Jean-Germain, your microphone is fading, and we need to wrap this up so we have time for questions. I have quite a few questions.
Okay, so I'll try to wrap up. So the international environment is different. I'm not suggesting that Sino-African relations are not shaped by asymmetry. Clearly, they are. China, depending on how you look at these things, is either the world's largest economy or the world's second largest economy. African countries are relatively minor players in the global economy. So when Chinese leaders and African leaders meet, there is asymmetry in power, and asymmetry in power translates generally into asymmetry in economic relations. But that asymmetry is moderated, I would argue, by the fact that African countries are sovereign, at least nominally so, and that African leaders have a degree of agency that their forebears did not have. So as much as China might want to exploit Africa, I think that there is a degree of moderation in that exploitation due to the structure of the global political economy. And from an African perspective, African elites not necessarily the African masses. African elites may have a preference for Chinese aid over Western aid, and for one major reason, and that is Chinese aid in Africa typically came with less overt political strings. I'm not saying that it doesn't come with overt economic string, but it's less overt political string. Simply put, the Chinese do not insist, for example, that Africans have free and fair elections. They don't. They try not to interfere in the domestic affairs of African states. And from the point of view of Africa's political elite, that is a major plus. Although the African masses may feel quite differently. So perception of Sino-African relations will vary depending on which Africans you are speaking to. The elite may find that there is benefit, immediate benefit to Chinese aid. I mean, who do not like to cut ribbons and open new ports and new bridges and so on. But you get a different picture when you talk to the average African who may have a different view of the Chinese role. So in some, we need to have a much more nuanced view of Sino-African relations. But from my own standpoint, it is those relations are neither neo-colonial nor benevolent. I would say that they are normal for our time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Let's proceed with some questions. I have quite a few already. Please send some more through the Q&A function. Jean-Germain, it would be helpful if you would turn off your slideshow so our audience could see you more clearly. One question that came up very early, you used the term scrambling, and I think for many of our people in our audience who are not as familiar with African history or the history of colonialism in Africa, could you just say a word about what you mean by scrambling?
The colonial period, which started in 1884, 1885 with the Berlin Conference, is usually colloquially called the Scramble for Africa.
Okay.
This was the meeting held in Berlin at which basically the major colonial powers essentially carved up Africa. So we call that the first scramble. So in African studies, we are now asking, is there a new scrambling underway, this time by the Chinese? So scrambling refers to the colonial period during which Africa was carved up by the Western powers.
Another question has been raised that since so much of Chinese assistance to Africa is in the form of major construction projects, what's the environmental impact, if there's any noticeable environmental impact of these major construction efforts?
So far, at least, that has not been an object of major attention, at least not by government. African governments seem much more interested in those projects because they're politicians. They want to show steel and cement going up, and so other than a few places like in Nigeria where you have, and in South Africa where you have a relatively strong environmental movement, for now at least. African elites seem more interested in brick and mortar.
Okay, well, early in your remarks, you said that the U.S. Is still the single largest provider of foreign aid to Africa. Right. Could you say something more about the character of U.S. foreign assistance to Africa? And how it differs from Chinese foreign assistance, even though the dollar value is greater, how is it different?
Okay, Chinese aid is to, again, be literally much more concrete. Infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, airports. The United States tends to support more soft areas, healthcare, education, policy reform, good governance. Obama did try to come up with an electricity program to increase energy in Africa. But the orientation of USA toward Africa has been towards, softer projects, which is kind of strange because in the 1950s, USA in the 60s resembled more what Chinese aid resemble now. The US was much more interested in infrastructure projects. But in the 1970s, under McNamara, you had starting with the World Bank, there was a shift from brick and mortar to sort of more education, human capital. And so that's where the US focus has been. But the difference also has been that US aid has been much more conditional than Chinese aid. The idea being that there should be greater accountability in terms of the way in which US fund is dispersed, and so which Africans find somewhat onerous, whereas the Chinese, they come in and they are much less intrusive from an African standpoint.
You said a few words towards the end of your remarks about public perceptions of China. Could you amplify that a little and to the extent possible, compare it to public perceptions of the United States among the rank and file population of the African nations?
Okay. Public perception of China is affected by the way in which Chinese aid is carried out. When China is involved in development projects in Africa, in infrastructure, it brings in Chinese workers. And you are also beginning to have in Africa, particularly in urban Africa, small-scale family-owned businesses. So you're talking about Chinese citizens who are more likely to come into contact with the average African. And so Chinese workers may be perceived to be taking jobs from Africans, and Chinese mom and pop shops may be seen to have an unfair competition against, African hawkers. And so you are seeing this tension at the base level. Whereas USA, is sort of very top heavy. You may have a few expatriates, coming into work in Africa, but the US do not send American workers en masse where they would interact with the average African, therefore causing potential tension. And so you are beginning to see, small Chinese communities emerging in urban Africa, and Chinese workers from China coming into Africa. And if there is any kind of misunderstanding between them and Africans, that gets blown out of proportion. Not unlike the way in which, ordinary Africans experience the police here.
Okay, I understand. It's an important, it's an important aspect of Chinese presence abroad, particularly in Africa, that their workers follow their investments.
Right. Yeah.
Can you say anything about perceptions of corruption associated with Chinese loans and other development assistance projects? The snippet that we saw from John Bolton suggested that this remains a big issue, at least in terms of the perspective of the Trump administration providing assistance to Africa. Is the same corruption an issue with Chinese development assistance projects?
No, I haven't found the Chinese development project concerned about corruption. Because what you are talking about is negotiation at the highest level, between ministers and Chinese officials. I don't have a sense that at the elite level, information filters down to the masses to the point where people are beginning to be concerned about corruption. I think the concern is whether Africa in the long term will be able to support or to meet its aid obligation toward Africa. I think that in other words, whether African aid, Chinese aid to Africa is sustainable. And in the end, if they turned out not to be sustainable, whether the Chinese will in fact now seize African assets in order to be paid. I think that's the bigger concern. The idea about the corruption concern, I think is expressed more here than it is in Africa.
We have a question though that raises this issue of protecting investments, protecting loans or the value of those loans. Let me read this directly to you, but my understanding was that Chinese investment came with a request for collateral to protect investments and potential militarization of infrastructure improvements such as seaports, airports, etc. Is this a continued issue in terms of Chinese investments in Africa, securing those assets?
You froze there, Joel, for a while. I didn't get the question.
The question was about the security of investments.
Right.
And is this a problem between African countries and China? Are African countries providing adequate security to protect the value of those investments?
Yes, I think that's the bigger concern that I was addressing in the previous question. In countries like Djibouti, where the Chinese just built a brand new port, they have insisted that Djibouti give them a long-term lease in order to recoup their investment. They also finished a brand new railway project in Kenya, where they will be running the railway for a number of years until they recoup their investment, and then they will ostensibly turn it over to the Kenyans. The concern in Africa is whether African countries will be able to meet the terms of those investments. And if they are not able to meet those terms, whether the Chinese will then move in and seize those assets. That's the concern. But what we have noticed is that the Chinese have shown a willingness to renegotiate with the Africans. In some instances, such as in Tanzania, for example, they forgive the debt. In other words, debtors and creditors are not always entirely at the mercy of debtors.
Well, not if you owe enough.
That's right. So the Chinese have shown a kind of deafness to sort of negotiate when they think that things will get out of hand. And so I think that's how they've tried. That's how this issue has been finessed. But that's a concern.
I think this gets us to our last question, and that's the U.S. critique of China's loan policies, particularly for these high-priced, high-prestige infrastructure developments, whether or not it's not creating excessive debt on the part of these borrower nations, which are, for the most part, relatively low-income nations. Right. Is there some substantive truth to this critique, or is this a political critique of by the U.S. and other Western powers of Chinese behavior, which has obviously been well received in many African countries?
Yeah, I think it's both. In the 1970s, the US and the West were much less concerned about countries incurring too much debt when they were the creditors. That's how Latin America got into trouble, right? But we also have to emphasize that in Africa, the infrastructure project, there is a kind of debt for equity ratio. The Chinese invest in infrastructure in Angola in return for oil. So it's not as if there is absolutely no collateral.
So it's essentially trade.
Yes. So in Nigeria, they build highways and they get paid in natural gas. So they are covering their back, so to speak. They're taking risk, but they would say as long as there is this kind of debt for equity, there is this swap, it's not an unreasonable risk for them.
Are there any African countries that have not been able to meet their loan repayment obligations?
The poor African countries, the ones that are less resource rich, such as Djibouti, which I mentioned earlier. But again, where you've had these issues, the Chinese have shown a willingness to renegotiate, to extend the terms of the loans. Because China doesn't have an interest in being seen in Africa as a predator. It may well have to be in some instances, but it doesn't want to have that reputation now, especially that it's under the microscope. So
okay, well, thank you. I'm going to end our Q&A session with Professor Groh, and I know you want to join me in thanking him. This was very comprehensive and very provocative and interesting to all of us. In just a moment, we're going to show the balance of the video that we saw the first 5 or 6 minutes of earlier in our session. We will be back on July 1st, that's 2 weeks from today, for the final 2021 Great Decisions session. Our speaker will be Captain William Wojtyra of the United States Navy. Captain Wojtyra is the commander of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, which is the only U.S. icebreaker in service in the Arctic region. He's going to be speaking about great power competition over the melting Arctic, a change of pace from today's topic, and well suited to a July 1st seminar. Thank you all for joining us. We'll resume the video in just 1 second. I'd like to close by asking all of you to consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. We are a membership organization, and we need your membership and support in order to enable us to continue to present interesting programs like today's to the St. Louis audience. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Jean-Germain. We appreciate your contribution. We appreciate your wise remarks. And let's resume our watching of the video. Thank you again.
Thank you.
U.S. officials are counting on the American private sector to make up the difference.
Taxpayer investment in Africa should incentivize other generosity. I think to the degree we can, we ought to work with our private sector partners to get them to go into Africa and help solve problems and make investments.
Let's marshal all of the power of American economic might in Africa and elsewhere, not just state resources, but also the resources of American private sector that promotes entrepreneurship. It promotes economic development, not just reliance upon the government that's writing a big check.
You simply cannot fill the void with American private investment going into the continent. I'm all for American private investment. I would like to see a lot more of it. But even our exports to Africa have not increased significantly in recent years.
I know as a former diplomat that we always wanted American companies to be involved in the countries that we were in, but we also have to think about what American companies are willing to risk. And China sees Africa as an opportunity, and American businesses tend to see Africa as a problem.
Lots of the US firms or European firms don't have the sufficient resources or risk appetite towards Africa. When talking about Africa, the Chinese do have a medium to long-term vision, and sometimes they are willing to take a relatively lower investment return.
In recent decades, Western creditors have moved away from funding large-scale infrastructure projects in the developing world.
Prior to the 80s, one of the biggest funders of infrastructure projects on the continent was the World Bank. So the World Bank had this ideological shift in the 90s to say, we don't do big infrastructure. There was this idea that the state needed to be taken out of economic activity. So what happened in Africa is was a huge backlog of infrastructure projects over the years. You know, we were lagging behind in power, in roads, in hospitals.
Now, many African governments in their national development plans, they put infrastructure first. And Western countries, including the US, have invested much less in infrastructure and invested more in aspects related to health, education, governance, promotion of democracy, and so on.
What is the sense in discussing for years to get a loan from the World Bank or from whoever? African countries, people are actually facing a lot of real life problems. People are dying because of poverty. Poverty is being multiplied across generations. So we don't have time to talk about some of these things.
But now, China's expanding influence in Africa has some Western policymakers rethinking the turn away from infrastructure.
I can detect, even with the most reluctant donors and the most reluctant economic partners of Africa, a change of attitude and much more interested on infrastructure, particularly after China has been much more ahead of the curve in terms of providing this type of support.
China has growing influence in Africa because they have a development bank that is willing to underwrite major infrastructure projects. The United States does not have that capacity, and there's no reason that we shouldn't. We can compete with China for economic influence in places like Africa, but only if we put on the table the kind of development deals that the Chinese are.
Yet, despite Washington's increasing interest in Africa, some experts question whether the U.S. is prepared to make the necessary political commitment to the continent.
Since 1990, the first overseas trip every year by the Chinese foreign minister is to Africa. And how many times has Secretary of State of the United States traveled to Africa in the past 10 years? The Chinese are willing to throw in the political capital. They're willing to throw in the economic capital.
Throughout the 90s and the early aughts, U.S. policy toward Africa was actually through a prism of development and humanitarian assistance. Africa wasn't seen as a place to do business until the Chinese came. The U.S. has never had to compete, really. But now, you're not the only actor out there.
First case of coronavirus confirmed in Nigeria.
Algeria, 20 cases. Burkina Faso, 2.
Fellow Ghanaians, I took the step to close all our borders.
Egypt, 59.
And I ordered a mandatory quarantine and testing.
Senegal, 5. Togo, 1.
D'un premier cas confirmé de coronavirus COVID-19.
With regard to the situation in Botswana, so far, 14 suspected cases.
This is a global crisis. Delay in action means death.
Without decisive action, the number of people infected will rapidly increase from a few hundred to tens of thousands.
When the COVID-19 pandemic hit Africa in the spring of 2020, Beijing sensed an opportunity. Both the Chinese government and private philanthropists, such as the Jack Ma Foundation, stepped in to provide critical supplies.
The market for PPE was overwhelmed and there were shortages, so they couldn't really
obtain it, even if they had the money for it. So when China provided the equipment or the materials, that was immensely appreciated by so many countries in Africa.
We have received 20,000 test kits from the Jack Ma Foundation and assorted personal protective equipment.
Social media platforms like WhatsApp are incredibly popular on the African continent. During the height of the pandemic, initially what was being sent around was that famous video of the Chinese constructing a hospital in record time. And there were lots of screenshots of Jack Ma's Twitter account that were floating around.
When the PRC sent a medical team to Algeria in April of 2020 in order to help with the fight against COVID-19, the rhetoric and the discourse used then was that this is only a continuation of a practice that has started in the 1960s when the PRC in 1963 sent the first medical team to Algeria. We've seen the PRC providing equipment, but also really accompanying that with the narrative that China and Africa have always been through a lot of challenges together.
As China captured attention across the African continent, some analysts worried that China's generosity might overshadow the support that the U.S. has given over many decades to improve healthcare in Africa.
We've taken note of the very modest financial donations that China and so-called private Chinese entities have dispersed in Africa. China's contributions to fighting the pandemic are paltry.
When you're providing $30 million and supporting the local Ministry of Health, that's good for a 2-paragraph story on page 4 of the local press, and that's about it. And then it disappears. When Jack Ma of Alibaba flies in a plane load of protective gear, you get 4 or 5 times the publicity.
We urge the Americans to use their energy on fighting the epidemic at home. Their attempt to undermine friendly relations between China and Africa will never succeed.
The world is not so transactional as, you give $1 for a vaccine and you get $1 worth of credit, where people are keeping these ledgers. People are keeping ledgers in their minds as to which countries are constructive actors in the international system, which countries give out of a sense of solidarity and a sense of being connected.
I think the United States is doing much more than it is given credit for, and it is extremely important to acknowledge. People will overlook that the United States has been involved with the continent for decades, has been involved in education, in healthcare, in human rights.
In April 2020, Chinese diplomats in Africa were forced to do damage control amid allegations of racism in the southern city of Guangzhou. There, some Chinese landlords had evicted African tenants, fearful that the African diaspora might transmit COVID-19.
There were also stories about restaurants refusing service to members of the African diaspora in Guangzhou, several parks that prohibited the Africans from going in. And so these issues started up a big conversation about racism and about race in China.
China was very quickly put under the spotlight of international scrutiny, and this created much diplomatic problems between China and African countries. In fact, multiple African governments sent their letters of protest to Chinese government. They summoned the Chinese ambassador to lodge their complaint about the treatment of the African nationals in Guangzhou.
It has been very much spread across social media. For those who were very much thinking that, that China is so different from the West on these particular issues, I think this has revealed that there's also a race issue in China, especially towards Black Africans.
But China was not the only country to grapple with concerns about racism in the spring of 2020.
The same way Africans were shocked by the fact that some Africans were poorly treated by some Chinese in China during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were eventually even more shocked by the fact that they were able to witness the police reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Anywhere where Black people tend to be treated badly, it tends to have lots of resonance on the continent. Chinese one was very surprising, precisely because China itself has been trying to spin this story of like, we are your friends, we're Africa's friends. Everybody else who's come before has treated you guys badly, but now we're equal partners. My sense is that the typical African is resigned to expect that kind of behavior from the US authorities towards Blacks.
Now, with African economies strained to the breaking point, both Chinese and Western creditors face urgent calls for debt relief.
What's happened with the pandemic is that African export revenues have shrunk. Most countries in Africa are still reliant on raw material exports for their economies, or things like tourism. These sectors have been hit very hard, and this means that those governments, those countries, don't have the revenues that they need in order to import medicine. They don't have the revenues they might need to import food.
Despite the very close relations between China and Africa, their debt relief efforts so far have been extremely timid. They have been very reluctant to engage through the G20 or other multilateral debt discussion fora, and they have focused on this bilateral type of negotiations.
They particularly have said that they would like to negotiate debt on a country-by-country basis, whereas African countries are trying to negotiate their debts collectively. There's a bit of a feeling that China is ambivalent on its stance.
The latest opinion polls, including an Afrobarometer survey of 18 countries completed in 2020, reveal that ordinary Africans are eager to learn from the experiences of both China and the US.
In your opinion, which of the following countries, if any, would be the best model for the future development of your country? And the United States ranked first here, 32%, and China ranked second with 23%.
It's difficult to know how many African countries really fully understand what is China's model of development. What they do see is a country that has done an enormous job at reducing poverty. They would like to emulate that. That doesn't mean they really understand how China got there.
They've lifted how many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so African governments look at that and they think they can learn something from China. The other part of the Chinese experience is that they're run by the Communist Party. It's an authoritarian dictatorship. And I don't think that's very attractive in Africa.
It also remains to be seen whether China can transform its economic clout into widespread interest in Chinese society and culture.
China has been quite successful in building a sense of its own power and utility, in that China is a very important economic and political player in Africa, and it can't be ignored across the continent. But I don't think that that's translated into a genuine sense of affection for China.
Not a lot of African people know a lot about China, but more and more that relationship and that image has changed over the last few years, and this is in part due to multiple projects and initiatives that encourage African students and Africans in general to travel to China for scholarships or for long-term trainings.
You now have a situation where Nigerian students are being sponsored to go to Chinese universities to learn things like engineering. The idea is they go to China, learn, and they come back to manage the railway that is being built by China. China is now one of the most popular destinations for African students, surpassing the US, surpassing the UK.
In recent years, more and more Africans have begun to study the Chinese language.
There is a wide variety of interest among African students who wants to learn Chinese. They see that if a lot of projects are being done by Chinese companies and corporations, then it becomes important for them to learn the language in order to be able to secure job opportunities with a lot of these Chinese firms.
Countries like Uganda, Kenya, South Africa include Mandarin courses in school curricula very early. However, the Afrobarometer in its last survey included a question stating which language African citizens consider to be the language of the future. And English largely scored the first rank, and this is not surprising.
China is not a place you go to for some glamorous outing. When folks say, I came back from China, stories are, I came back from China, you won't believe what they have done with their highways. Nobody ever says, I came back from China, I went and watched a great Chinese play. It's a practical country. You know, it's a place that you go to visit to learn about practicalities and not to enjoy life.
As relations between China and the U.S. sour, African leaders must navigate the thorny landscape of what some commentators have characterized as a new scramble for Africa.
Africa ultimately is going to make its own decisions about what is best for them. We shouldn't view Africa as a colonial era chessboard in which we are trying to compete with Russia or China for influence and control. We should be invested in the African people.
I think it'd be really naive to say that there aren't spheres in which China and the United States are competitors, but there are places where Chinese and American interests align. One of those places is development in Africa. So the last thing Africa needs is Chinese-American competition. We don't need that. We've got enough problems of our own.
Today, Africa is home to 5 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies and is poised to double its population by 2050. It is also one of the places most vulnerable to emerging threats and the changing climate. In the decades to come, no matter how the U.S. rivalry with China develops, Africa is poised to take center stage in the foreign policy of both countries.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.